Hello, and welcome to our Chapter a Day series going through the book of Genesis. Today we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 8, where we're coming to the flood's conclusion. If you've been following with us, you've been watching this journey from the description of the creation of the universe, God's creation of humanity, and our purpose as image bearers. You've seen the account of man's rebellion against God and the consequence that was brought upon us, falling under the mastery of sin and the penalty of death. We've seen the generations of people moving forward. We've come to the account of the flood and the introduction of the character of Noah. Last day we looked at the flood coming upon the earth, and now we come to the conclusion of that catastrophic event. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 8. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and the rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. This chapter is set to open with that important phrase. So the waters have swept over the earth. They prevailed over the earth for 150 days, we had read. And then we come to these words. But God remembered Noah. But God remembered Noah and all that were with him. Sometimes in the face of calamity, in the face of horrible circumstance, we can ask ourselves, well, where is God in this? And we see in this picture, as great calamity is swept across the earth, as great judgment has been poured out on the earth through the flood. Now Noah and his wife and his sons' wives and these animals are in this boat, in this ark, floating on top of the waters, the only living things on top of the waters. God remembers. God does not forget about his people. God remembers. That is something that we need to hold on to and not lose sight of in the journey of our own lives, that God remembers his people. He had made a covenant with Noah. He had made a promise to Noah that he would save him through this judgment, and God remembered Noah. So now we go through the journey of the conclusion of the flood. At the end of the 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. And in the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven. And it went to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him in the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days and again sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening. And behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove. And she did not return to him any more. In the 601st year, in the 1st month, the 1st day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. And the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. And God said to Noah, Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, the birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his wife's and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth, went out by families from the ark. Just to have an idea of the time scale we're talking about, if we look at all the dates and time references that we see in this part of the narrative, we know that from the beginning of the flood, that 40 days we saw the rain. For 150 days, we had the flood waters raging. So from the beginning, 40 days of rain and the fountains of the deep being opened up. From the beginning, 150 days of the flood waters raging on the earth and then beginning to subside. At 124 days from the beginning of the flood, the mountaintops reappear. After that, we have another 40 days from the time the mountaintops appear to Noah sending out a raven. The raven flies around. Noah sends out a dove 7 days later. The dove comes back, it has no place to rest. Noah waits 7 days and sends out the dove again. This time the dove returns with an olive leaf. Noah waits 7 days and sends out the dove again. At this point, it does not return. It's interesting when you look at this part of the story, and there's much that's been said about the symbolism here, that at first Noah sends out the raven would be considered under the Mosaic covenant to be an unclean animal because it's a scavenger. It'll land anywhere, it'll feed on anything that may be available to it. So the raven is content to go out. The dove, the first time the dove is sent out, the dove will not scavenge. So it returns back because there's nothing clean for it. Then it's sent out again, and this time it brings back the olive leaf. This picture of the earth regrowing and that symbol of peace, which we've taken today, and we've actually used it as our picture of peace. It's interesting that you'll see it on logos and such of the dove with an olive branch in its mouth as that symbol of peace. And we talk about extending the olive branch when its origin comes from this picture from the conclusion of the flood story. That as the dove brings back this olive leaf, it's proof that God's judgment has subsided, that the wrath of God has ceased for this time, that there is peace now on the earth. And then the last time we see the dove sent out, the dove doesn't return. He's found a safe resting place and doesn't have to come back to the ark. But that's not the point when they're released, because we look at it, it's still 314 days from the beginning of the flood. They're still in the ark. This is the point where Noah takes off the covering of the ark, opening up any areas that can be exposed to air and sunlight. But it is not until 371 days have gone by that God permits them to leave. That's more than a year from the beginning of the flood, from when God closes the door till God gives them permission to go back out onto the earth. It's more than a year before the earth is now habitably safe for them to go forth into a world which has now been reformed for them. And then we see in verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So the first thing we see, according to the narrative, that Noah does coming out of the ark, stepping onto this reformed earth, this earth that has been cleansed of the violence and corruption that was upon it. The first thing that Noah does is Noah offers sacrifice. Noah recognizes his debt. He offers a sacrifice to God. And we read, and when the Lord, Yahweh, the covenant God, smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So God makes a proclamation here as he looks on the sacrifice offered by Noah. Noah, who is seeking to walk with God, God makes an important pronouncement. Actually, I'll better to call it a declaration. So God's declaration. He says that he will never curse the earth for man's sin. He will never curse the earth for man's sin. And he will never destroy all living creatures because of man. This is both a proclamation of God's desire and his new covenant with Noah to walk with Noah, but it's also showing us something that we need to understand as we move forward. In this event that God brought about, we saw God's judgment upon the whole earth. Now God is focusing us specifically on our sin and our own accountability. So God is not going to curse the earth because of our sin. God is not going to destroy all living creatures because of our sin. Now our sin rests on our own heads. No longer will the rest of creation be judged according to what we have done, but as long as the earth exists in its present form, we are being held accountable for our own sin. But at this moment, what we see is God's desire to minister and to bless. Even though God knows who we are. It's interesting that in chapter 6 we read that statement about the condition of our heart and the intent of our heart. And now in chapter 8 it's repeated again. It hasn't gone away. So even though Noah has walked with God, even though Noah and his family have been saved from God's judgment upon the earth because they trusted in him, the sin problem remains. The sin problem remains. It is not gone because Noah is a sinner. His wife is a sinner. His sons are sinners. Their wives are sinners. They will continue to follow in their evil ways because it's part of our nature trapped under the mastery of sin. So sin continues. And even though we see this massive judgment, you think, what a symbol of God's judgment and the need to submit to God. But as we're going to see in the chapters that will be following, it does not take us long as human beings to follow into our old patterns because sin continues. This is important for us to grasp because this helps us understand the power of sin over humanity. That even experiencing salvation from such a judgment is not enough to turn humankind in the right direction. Why? Because we are under the mastery of sin. We'll wrap up the final part of the flood as we go into Genesis chapter 9. I hope this has been an encouragement to you. I hope you've been able to follow the timeline here. We see God is working. And remember that key point that we mentioned before. God remembers. In the midst of the flood, God remembered Noah. He didn't forsake him. He kept his promise. He kept the covenant he had made with Noah because God is faithful. Remember that and meditate on that today. I would encourage you to reread the chapter and think about all that is in it. As always, we'd love to hear your feedback, and if this has been an encouragement to you or a challenge to you, please share it with somebody else. Thank you, and God bless.